The year was 1905, and the logging town of Iron Hollow, tucked deep in the Missouri backwoods, lived and breathed the sound of axes biting into timber. Among the men who swung those axes, none worked harder or more quietly than Elias Finch. Elias was known for his precision. He never felled a tree without whispering something under his breath first. Some said it was prayer. Others said it was madness. He would pause before every swing, lay his calloused hand on the bark, and murmur, "Forgive me." The other loggers laughed. "Finch thinks the trees got feelings," they'd say. But Elias never answered. He was a widower, and the forest was the only thing that still talked back to him in some way. That summer, the company cleared a patch near Whispering Ridge, a section of woods locals said was haunted. Elias didn't believe in hauntings until the night he heard his name echoing softly through the trees. It was past midnight when Elias woke to the sound of a voice, soft, trembling, and impossibly near. "Elias." He sat up in his bunk. The logging camp was still, save for the creak of trees swaying in the night breeze. He told himself it was a dream, but then he heard it again, this time closer. "Elias, why did you take me?" He stepped outside, lantern in hand, scanning the misty timber line. The voice seemed to come from every direction. His lantern flickered. Then, from deep among the pines, he saw a tree bleeding, thick sap oozing like tears down its trunk. The next morning, Elias said nothing, but his hands trembled so badly he could barely hold his axe. The foreman, Harlan Poe, noticed. "You sick, Finch?" "No, sir," Elias muttered. "Just didn't sleep well." But the truth was, Elias wasn't sure if the forest was real anymore, or if it was calling him back for something he'd done long ago. Days turned into weeks, and the men kept cutting. The company wanted lumber for the new rail line. One morning, Elias and a young logger named Tommy Grieve were sent to fell a massive oak that towered above the rest. It was older than the town itself. When Elias struck it, the axe made a strange, hollow sound, as if the heart of the tree was missing. "Strange," Elias murmured. "Maybe it's rotten," Tommy said. They drove the wedges, and as the giant fell, it let out a groan that sounded almost human. Inside the trunk, they found something that made both men freeze, a carved cross deep within the wood, long before the bark had grown around it. Tommy backed away. "Who would do that?" Elias stared at the mark and whispered, "Someone who wanted to be remembered." That night, Elias dreamed of a woman's voice again, pleading, crying, and the whisper of leaves brushing his name. Elias wasn't always a logger. 20 years before, he'd been a farmer near the Little Black River. His wife, Clara, had died during childbirth, and his newborn son, James, vanished one morning while Elias was chopping firewood near the edge of the woods. They said the river took the boy, but Elias never believed that. He'd heard crying in the forest that night, and though he searched for days, he never found even a shoe. Now, standing in the clearing near Whispering Ridge, Elias felt something stirring, an old grief coming back to life. The forest around him seemed alive with memory. Every creak of a branch felt like a breath. Every fallen leaf whispered, "Come home." He started to keep a small notebook, writing down the names of the trees he cut, almost like a prayer list. He told no one, but beside one name he scribbled something else. James, still lost? One evening, just before sunset, a stranger arrived at the logging camp. He was thin, dressed in a long coat, and carried no tools. "Name's Sheriff Colton Rains," he said. "I'm here about a report. Someone hearing voices up this way?" The men laughed, pointing to Elias. "Talk to Finch," one of them said. "He's the one who hears trees sing lullabies." The sheriff turned to Elias. "You hearing things, son?" Elias hesitated. "Maybe, but not things of this world." The sheriff studied him. "There's been talk of missing folks near these woods. You see anything strange?" Elias swallowed hard. "I seen plenty strange, Sheriff. But most of it's in men, not trees." That night, the sheriff stayed near the fire. Elias couldn't sleep. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of the same voice. But this time it said, "They buried me where the roots run deep." He woke gasping, clutching his chest. The next morning, Elias led the sheriff to the fallen oak where the carved cross had been found. "Right here," Elias said. "This is where I heard it clearest." The sheriff knelt and ran his hand through the soil near the roots. His fingers brushed against something solid. He dug a little, then froze. "God Almighty," he whispered. They unearthed a small wooden box, sealed with pitch. Inside was a bundle of fabric, decayed, fragile, and beneath it, a locket with a photograph inside. Elias's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was the faded face of a woman, his wife, Clara. He fell to his knees. "That's my Clara," he whispered. "But how did this get here?" The sheriff looked at him carefully. "You sure about that?" Elias nodded, tears burning his eyes. "I buried her on our farm, Sheriff." "Not here." The forest was silent. Then, from the ridge, came the soft rustle of branches that almost sounded like laughter. Word spread fast through camp. Men refused to cut near the ridge anymore. Foreman Harlan tried to keep order. "We got quotas. Ghost stories don't pay wages." But when two men quit after hearing voices at dawn, even Harlan couldn't deny something was wrong. That night, Sheriff Raines spoke with the town's oldest resident, Martha Griggs, who lived by the river bend. She told him of an old legend, of settlers who'd once buried their dead near the trees for protection, believing the spirits would guard them. But some burials, she said, were not made in peace. "Sometimes," she warned, "the ones buried unjustly don't rest easy." The trees remember. When Raines returned, he found Elias sitting alone by the stump of the oak, lantern glowing softly beside him. "She said they remember," Elias muttered. "And maybe they remember me." That night, the sky broke open. Thunder rolled through the valley, and rain hammered the ridge until the soil turned to mud. Elias and the sheriff took shelter in the tool shed. Through the downpour, Elias heard the voices again, hundreds this time, whispering, crying, calling his name. The sheriff looked uneasy. "You hear that?" Elias nodded. "They're angry." Lightning struck the far end of the clearing. The next morning, when they went to inspect the damage, they found another tree, a massive pine, split clean in two. Inside the trunk was a length of cloth, tangled in the wood like it had grown there, and embroidered on that cloth, faint but visible, was a name: James Finch. Elias's world stopped. The sheriff had the cloth examined by the town preacher and his wife, both of whom confirmed the name. Elias couldn't stop staring at it. "My boy, he's been here all this time." The sheriff asked, "Could someone have taken him?" Elias nodded slowly. "There was a man, my old neighbor, Cale Hargis. He disappeared around the same time Harlan, the foreman, spoke up." "You mean old Hargis?" "Folks said he built his cabin up by Whispering Ridge, right near here." The sheriff gathered a search team, but Elias didn't wait. He followed the sound of the trees himself, each whisper guiding him deeper, every root pulling him towards something buried beneath the moss. As he walked, the wind picked up, swirling through the branches until they seemed to form words. "He took me, Papa." Elias found the cabin near dusk. It was half collapsed, eaten by ivy, and smelled of rot and smoke. Inside, he found rusted tools, a child's toy horse, and a cradle made from oak boards. On the far wall, carved into the wood, were 3 words: "I am sorry." Elias dropped to his knees, sobbing. The sheriff arrived minutes later, following his trail. "Elias, what did you find?" Elias pointed to a small mound behind the cabin. "He's here, Sheriff. My boy's here. The forest told me they dug carefully until the spade struck bone. A child's skeleton, wrapped in the same embroidered cloth." Elias wept over the grave as the rain began to fall again. But as lightning flashed across the ridge, the sheriff swore he saw something impossible. The trees around them bending, their branches low, almost as if bowing. Sheriff Raines stood beside the small grave long after the others had left. He'd seen murder scenes, drownings, even hangings. But nothing like this. The forest was too still, too heavy, like it was holding its breath. Elias knelt beside the uncovered bones, his lantern trembling in his hand. "I prayed for 20 years, he whispered, "begged God for a sign. And now, he sends me this?" The sheriff laid a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it ain't God sending it, Elias. Maybe it's someone else who needs peace." Elias looked up, eyes hollow. "Then I'll give it to them. Whatever they want." That night, the sheriff couldn't sleep. Each gust of wind outside his tent sounded like a whisper. "He knows." The next morning, the foreman found Elias sitting by the stump of the split pine, his logbook open on his lap. Inside, beside the names of trees, was something new. A letter. It read, "To whoever finds this, if I do not return, know that the forest was right. My sin was not cutting trees, but turning my back on what they tried to tell me. The land remembers what men forget." When the sheriff read it, he felt a chill. He gathered the men and ordered a halt to all logging near Whispering Ridge. But Harlan protested, "You can't stop the work. The company owns this land." The sheriff stared him down. "Not anymore, it don't. It belongs to the dead." That night, Elias vanished. His cot was empty. Only his axe remained, laid neatly across his folded blanket. The search began at dawn. Men combed through the ridge calling Elias's name, but their voices came back warped, echoing through the trees like a mocking chorus. Sheriff Raines and Tommy Grieve found boot tracks leading toward the ravine, where the oldest trees stood, the ones no one dared cut. As they entered the hollow, the air grew thick, heavy with pine and decay. Tommy whispered, "It feels like they're watching us." And they were. The trees stood so close, their roots twisted like fingers clutching the earth. In the heart of the grove lay something carved into the bark of a massive cedar. "James." Fresh letters, still bleeding sap. The sheriff gripped his revolver. "He's out here." But who's writing the names? By evening, the men were ready to turn back, but the sheriff pressed on alone. As twilight bled through the branches, he heard a faint sound, singing, a lullaby. He followed it until he came to a clearing filled with fireflies. There, beneath a tree, sat Elias. He was rocking something in his arms. "Elias," the sheriff called softly, "what have you got there?" Elias turned. His eyes were glassy, but calm. "He's sleeping, Sheriff. My boy's finally sleeping." In his arms was nothing but an old log, shaped vaguely like a child. Rain stepped closer. "Elias, that's just wood." Elias looked down and smiled faintly. "You can't see it, can you? You don't listen like they do." And then, as the wind stirred, the sheriff swore he heard it too. A faint child's laugh weaving through the leaves. The next morning, a thick smoke rose from the ridge. The men ran toward it to find flames curling through the trees. Elias's lantern, tipped over, had set the brush ablaze. "Get water!" Harlan shouted. They fought the fire for hours, but the blaze moved fast, leaping from branch to branch. The sheriff finally found Elias near the heart of it, standing still as the fire danced around him. "Elias, you'll burn alive." Elias didn't move. His voice was soft but steady. "If that's what it takes for them to rest, so be it." The sheriff lunged forward, dragging him away as a burning pine crashed behind them. When it was finally over, much of the ridge lay in ashes. But strangely, the trees nearest the small grave were untouched. Days later, as the smoke cleared, the sheriff noticed something odd. The great cedar where the name James had been carved was still standing, green and whole, untouched by flame. He touched the bark, and beneath his hand it was warm, almost like flesh. Elias, bandaged and weak, looked up from his cot. "It wouldn't burn because it's not done yet." "Not done?" the sheriff asked. Elias nodded. "The one who took my boy, he's still out there." His soul never faced what he did. That night, Rains found something new near the cedar's roots, a rusted knife, its handle carved with the initials C.H., Cale Hargis. And beside it, buried in the dirt, was a second locket, this one with a photograph of a young boy. The sheriff realized then Cale had taken James, but died before confessing. The trees had been keeping the secret, whispering it for decades. Elias demanded to see the cedar again. When they brought him there, he laid his hand against the bark and began to speak, not to the sheriff, but to the tree itself. "I forgive him," he said softly. "He was a broken man, like I was." The forest grew still. Even the birds fell silent. Then, slowly, the wind rose through the branches, carrying with it the faint sound of a child's laugh, clearer this time, joyful. Rains watched in awe as the bark around the carved name began to shift, the letters softening until they vanished completely. The cedar let out a creak, almost like a sigh. And for the first time in years, Elias smiled. Elias insisted that James be buried properly, this time with both lockets joined in one coffin. The sheriff, the preacher, and the loggers gathered in the clearing as Elias placed the small casket beneath the cedar's roots. He spoke quietly. "You called my name through the trees so I'd remember who I was. A father. Not a man of axes and timber, but a man who listens." The preacher led a short prayer. As they covered the grave, the wind swept through the trees, and the sunlight broke through the canopy like a blessing. For a moment, it felt as though the forest itself was breathing again. Weeks later, the company closed its operation at Whispering Ridge. Too many men refused to return, claiming they still heard whispers at night. Elias stayed behind. He built a small cabin near the cedar and spent his days planting new saplings. Sheriff Rains visited him once in autumn. "You sure you want to live out here alone?" Elias smiled faintly. "I'm not alone." The forest forgave me. He showed the sheriff his logbook, now filled with hundreds of new names, not of fallen trees, but of those he planted. At the bottom of the page, he'd written, "James Finch, replanted, remembered." In the spring of 1910, 5 years later, travelers passing through Iron Hollow found an overgrown path leading to a grove of unusually tall trees. At its center stood a cabin, empty and quiet. Elias Finch was gone. But beside the cedar tree, where the wind always seemed to whisper differently, the sheriff found Elias's axe, buried halfway in the soil, and a small carving on the trunk. When the wind speaks your name, listen. It might be love calling you home. And as the breeze passed through the leaves, Sheriff Rains could have sworn he heard it. A man's voice, soft and content, answering back, "I'm here." The trees swayed gently, almost like they were bowing once again. The cold case of Elias Finch was closed that day. But for those who walked the ridge after sunset, the forest still hummed, a peaceful, forgiving song that only the listening could hear.